Well, good morning to the people who are here in person today and the people who are following via the live stream. So it is the third of our series of talks on Pádraig Tuama's kitchen hymns. We have seen already two poems. The title was Do You Believe in God? And we reached the third series of the third section in the collection, which is called "In a Garden by a Gate." In a Garden by a Gate, which is one of the most intriguing parts of this collection of poems. It is an experiment made by Pádraig Tuama. He says about it that it is playfully theological. The main characters in this series of poems is Jesus himself, or is a version of Jesus. A version of Jesus that in an interview I will quote a bit later, he calls the Hell Jesus. And then the other character is Persephone, this character from Greek mythology. The Hell Jesus is the Jesus who descended into hell. We every time we say the Creed on a Sunday, we say this sentence, which I don't know whether or not we think about, we realize. We say that, Jesus was suffered death, he was buried, and he descended into hell. And it is based, this tradition of Jesus descending into hell, on few New Testament passages, in particular 1 Peter 3:18-20, where it is said that Christ preached to the spirits in prison. It has always been interpreted as the people in the underworld. And Ephesians 4:9, Christ descended into the lower parts of the earth. And these texts were understood in Christian tradition to mean that after his death, Christ entered the realm of the dead, which is called Sheol in Hebrew, Hades in Greek, and Inferi in Latin. Now, hell here does not mean the place of eternal damnation. It's not the hell described by Dante Alighieri, where there are so many forms of torture and suffering for the people who have been naughty. But it is the place where the dead go, and it is seen across these traditions, the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Latin, as a place where there is a diminished form of living. After death, there is a sense in which only the shadow of this existence continues, and people are wandering in this place of darkness. They are not being punished. They just have a diminished form of existence. And even in the Hebrew scripture, when progressively, slowly, people started to believe in life after death. At the beginning, they didn't believe in life after death. When slowly, in the Hebrew tradition, they started to conceive the possibility of life after death, it was this form of life they thought about, this Sheol, this form of diminished continuation of existence. Now, what is meant by Jesus, why it is important to put in the Creed that Jesus descended into hell? The Christian tradition has given various answers. In English language, there is this famous expression, the harrowing of hell, that is the raiding, the storming, the plundering of hell. So between his death and his resurrection, the tradition has developed this image, this idea. Obviously nobody knows what happened, but this idea that Christ brought salvation to those who had already died before his coming. So in number 2.4 in your handout, the idea, it includes harrowing of hell, includes the ideas of victory over death. Christ endures death fully so that nothing is untouched by his redemption. And death is not just in the traditional way in which life after death has been conceived, not just the actual dying, but what happens to us, after we have died. Then liberation of the dead, the people who died before his arrival, and solidarity. The descent expresses Christ's complete identification with human mortality. He shares not only death, but the silence and the separation of the grave. So, in spiritual terms, Christ's descent into hell assures believers that there is no place too far for God to come and to rescue us. There is this sentence in the Psalms, even darkness is not dark for you. Even there you reach us. This is the setting really of this series of poems, and in Greek mythology there is the character of Persephone. If you go in number in your handout, in number 4 in your handout, Persephone is the daughter of Zeus and Demeter in Greek mythology, and the idea was that she was abducted by Hades, who is the god of the underworld, and she became queen of the underworld, but returns to earth each spring. So the myth of Persephone explains the seasons. A time below in the underworld brings winter, her return brings growth. As she embodies both life and death, innocence and power, and serves as a symbol of transformation and survival. What Pádraig Tuama imagined is that when Jesus goes to hell, he meets Persephone, and there is a conversation between the two of them. There is an interaction, an exchange between the two of them. So if you go in number 3 in your handout, Tuama imagines the descent into hell not as a time of victory, a time of triumph, but as interiority, so something that happens inside each one of us, and a time of despair. Hell is the underworld inside the body, the mind. It is a place of rage, it is a place where trauma finds its expression, of silence and emptiness. And the Hell Psalms, as he calls these poems, display Jesus not as triumphant, but as vulnerable, learning from Persephone what it means to live without certitude, to feel rage, and to inhabit liminal space, spaces that are in between. If you remember, the poem we saw last time had all these dashes at the end of each sentence, and each of these dashes was supposed to be an in-between space, a space of liminality. And these were the spaces, these dashes, these silences at the end of each line were supposed to be the real places where God can be found. So the descent into hell for Tuama is not just a past event, but an experience of the present. Whenever one goes through despair, silence, or absence of God, Christ is there too. I gave you a number of quotations from this interview I mentioned to you several times, Kate Miller interviewing Pádraig Tuama. Again, I gave you the link to the interview, the web page in a footnote, that in which Pádraig Tuama gives an explanation of what he wanted to do in this series of poems. So I don't know if you have had time to read them. I know that I read the poems before reading the interview, and then I read the interview, and it really helped me to make sense of a lot of what was going on in those pages. He says, Tuama, in number 5 in your handout, I found myself in the persona of Jesus of Nazareth in the underworld, not any theological imagination of Jesus, but a mask, he says, a truth-telling mask, maybe a part of me, maybe a part of my reading of these texts too. I wondered, what would Jesus say? What would his speaking voice be? In number 6, he says that character, this hell Jesus, is in despair towards the beginning, but not towards the end. The idea is Jesus has been tortured and is traumatized. So arrives in hell, bringing with him the trauma of his passion. And obviously, in the underworld, he still carries on the experience of the silence of God. God is not responding to him. On the cross, he cries to God, God, my God, why have you abandoned me? And there is no answer. And in the imagination, or in the poetic imagination of Pádraig or Tuama, this silence of God carries on while he's in the underworld, which makes sense. Jesus is not risen from the dead yet. And it is a way, he gives him a way of giving voice to trauma, to despair, but also to the possibility of growing from this trauma and despair into some kind of acceptance, some kind of resolution. Probably is not the word, but some kind of learning how to live with this pain, with this trauma, with this experience of pain. In number 8, he keeps saying, this is still Pádraig or Tuama, these poems are also an experience of solitude, a person in conversation with himself, a person addressing a you who never speaks back, which is the experience we saw in the other poems. They are a reflection of interiority. So on the one hand, it is the underworld, but on the other hand, it's inside a body, it's inside a brain, he says. Something that happens inside you. So the underworld is a space where you end up being when you are caught up by the trauma and when you are in despair or suffering and are reminded of this in your daily life. And he adds, but just because there's no light in those places, it doesn't mean that there is no enlightenment. There is a glimmer of hope. There is a progression. There is a growth in those poems. The character speaking in the Hell Psalms, this Hell Jesus, of course, moves away from previous ideas of God and is beginning to move into some kind of experience of speaking to a favorite emptiness. If you remember, favorite emptiness is one of the ways in which Pádraig or Tuama calls God in the poem, Do You Believe in God We Saw Last Time? He gives to God a number of names, and at one point he says, my favorite emptiness, suggesting the idea that it is not any kind of emptiness. It's an emptiness that you might find a way of cherishing somehow, because paradoxically it might be the place of a certain experience of God. I will not go through all the quotations. I left them for you to read. I really want to go to the poem as soon as possible. I just want to go, so if you go to number 15, now it is really interesting what happens in those poems. It's fascinating to see the conversation between Jesus and Persephone. What Tuama wanted to do is create a character who would be on the same level as Jesus, another God, and a character who also had been victim of violence, Persephone had been abducted, had been violated, had been made prisoner of the underworld, and she had been there for a long time. So a character that also had learned over a long time to live with the experience of trauma and pain. And imagines Jesus arriving in hell, in the underworld, fresh from his trauma, traumatized, afraid, and on the other hand, and meeting Persephone, and Persephone immediately understanding that this character comes from great pain, and progressively trying to establish a conversation with him and sharing his wisdom, her wisdom, with him. I think the experiment is quite interesting. I don't know how much you have stayed with these poems. I have for a little while, and the more I go back to them, the more I find that they, this progression and this growth in intimacy between the two characters is fascinating. He, the hell's Jesus, is not from anywhere now, and they, Jesus and Persephone, each know that they are gods. He, for the first time, it seems, or certainly the way I've constructed it, says, has met an equal. He's saying, oh, you know my father is God, and she's like, mine too, and he's a bastard. He's been in hell, and she's like, oh, I've been there more times than I can count, 100 times, 100 winters. There are ways that he is experiencing touch, not only physically, but also intellectually. There is a reciprocity between him and Persephone. There is a deep respect, albeit deep trauma and wariness between them. Kate Miller, who is the interviewer, she's a very perceptive interviewer. Her questions are quite interesting in this interview. She says this: that makes me think of the moment where Persephone asks the hell Jesus, what keeps you returning? And he says, I need to feel. That moment felt like a microcosm of what's happening in the whole collection. That garden, the garden by a gate is the title of the collection, is a place where the Jesus character is being given permission to feel all kinds of things that he hadn't had permission to feel. The book itself is a garden where the poems can interrogate feelings that have been suppressed or avoided for whatever reason. And one of them is rage. One of the themes of the collection Kitchen Hymns is how to deal with rage, give expression to rage, especially the rage that comes from trauma and suffering, the rage that is hidden and suppressed, and yet at the same time wants to get out there. If you go to number 22, there is a wall of rage, a wall of refusal in him, in Jesus. A rage which is understandable. You know, he thought God was with him, God was protecting him. He has endured unbearable, unspeakable suffering. Now he's in the underworld. God is not responding to him. So this rage is completely understandable. Later on, in the middle of the night, he wakes her up and he destroys the whole world and the heavens in order to show through a kind of imagined cosmic correlative projection of what rage can do in you. You know, the destruction that rage can bring. And Persephone goes, watch, and she does the same thing. They experience something like catharsis in their meeting of rage, and that is at no point sat down and facilitated through conversation. And he adds, the last quotation, rage and trauma are experiences of the body, and they are resolved through creative experiences of the body rather than cognitive experiences of explaining it all. When Tuama is saying this, you have to remember that he worked as a mediator between Protestants and Catholics in a process of reconciliation. And so he knows what it is to have people meeting and bringing together hatred, rage, and how they react, and what are the ways in which progressively you can bring some sort of, if not reconciliation, at least a space where people can feel listened to, where this rage can be listened to, this pain can be listened to. Let's go then to the poem. Another poem with the title, Do You Believe in God? Is the third one. There's a section with this title. There are a number of poems with this title. This is one which is at page 43. It is Persephone talking to the hell Jesus. Do you believe in God after all that you've been through? She asked. I'm not sure, he said. Do you? Not like I used to, she replied. I grew up thinking God was light, then I went to where there was no light. I used to think that God made all things new, but I've been wandering a while now. Nothing's new. Everything's a lens through which another everything can be viewed. That screws you up and releases you. I look at dawn now and love the turning, the way that morning is both dead and new. How about you? I like walking alone at twilight, he said. I like the in-between. She held his gaze, asked, Is that your answer? It's all I've got, he said. Let's do the same thing we did the other time. So I suggest that you stay on the poem, and I'm going to give you a line-by-line poetic analysis of it. And then you will, if you want, go back to the part of the handout where you have the explanation of the text. Of course, an interpretation of the text. It's by no means the only one possible, as I said to you earlier. It's not supposed to. So do you believe in God after all you've been through, she asked. So Persephone is asking Jesus, you evidently come from great suffering, is the passion, is the death on the cross. So do you still believe in God after all that? So the poem opens with a question. Again, you have this dialogue, which we found especially in the first poem, which is very, very important. He said, she said. This is the way in which a lot of the poems of this collection are constructed. Persephone addresses Jesus not as a teacher or a redeemer, but a fellow sufferer. That's the experiment that Tuama wanted to try. What it is to talk to Jesus not as God, not as someone who knows all, has the answer to all the questions, but as a fellow sufferer. Both Persephone and hell Jesus are survivors of violation, standing in a garden that is the gate to hell. And the question is, after what has been done to you, can you still believe in God? I'm not sure, he said, Jesus says, do you? What is interesting here is that Jesus does not come with the authoritative answer, in truth, I tell you. That's the way in which he usually answers questions in the Gospels. But he acknowledges his own uncertainty. I'm not sure, he said. And then he accepts the reciprocity with Persephone, turning the question back to her. We have a Jesus who accepts that he has things to learn, which is consistent with the incarnation and the idea of Jesus. There's been a theological tradition that says that Jesus had all the knowledge, because he was God. But there is another tradition, theological tradition, that says if he was really human like us, if he became really a man, part of the experience of being human is that of learning, having to learn things. And it's much more interesting to imagine a Jesus who learned everything from his mother, from his father, from Joseph, and from the synagogue, and etc., etc. Persephone replies, "Not like I used to believe in God," she replied. "I grew up thinking God was light, then I went to where there was no light." She was condemned to the underworld. Persephone, embodies wisdom about living without certitude, because she's caught forever, for all eternity, in this in-between darkness and light, winter and spring, underworld and the world where we all live. And her words voice the long knowledge of someone who has endured 100 winters, 100 deaths, right? And the metaphor of light, God was light, it's in the prologue of the Gospel of St. John. It's traditionally in spirituality, God is seen as light. But here the metaphor collapses. Light as divine presence no longer holds when one lives in the underworld, when one is prisoner of, suffering and trauma. Persephone, who knows hell intimately, speaks with the authority of one whose beliefs are tested against darkness. But here again, the fact that there is no light doesn't mean that there is no enlightenment, as Tuama said in the passage of the interview I quoted to you earlier. She keeps on saying, "I used to think that God made all things new, but I've been wondering a while now, nothing's new." So here there is an echo to Revelation 21:5. He, God, says, "I'm making everything new." There is this promise, which is contradicted by lived experience. The reality of the world and of our own lives seems that there is nothing new on earth. I mean, there is suffering, there is evil. The liberation which has been promised doesn't seem to work, doesn't seem to be so effective. And there is an echo here, I didn't put it in the handout, to the book of Coelet. I can't remember what is the Ecclesiasticus. I mean, it's always, the Latin name is always complicated. But Coelet, vanity of vanity, everything is vanity. And at one point he says there is nothing new in the world. Nothing new in the world. Again, however unconventional this approach to Jesus might seem, it is an echo of strands of spirituality you find in Scripture, in the Old Testament. And then there is, visually, you see, and I told you last time, nothing is left nothing is by accident in a poem. So you see there is a space at the beginning of the line, the following line. So I used to think that God made all things new, but I've been wondering a while now, nothing's new. And then nothing. You see there's a long, half of the line is empty. There is nothing new, so there is a suspension there. And then there is something which is slightly more intellectual, slightly more philosophical somehow. Everything's a lens through which another everything can be viewed. I'm not sure about the interpretation of this sentence. It seems to explain what is nothing new is that every experience we have is somehow colored. It's like when you have a lens, which is colored lens, you see it gives a shade of color to everything. So if you have a dark lens, everything you see is dark. if you have a pink lens, everything you see is pink, which is a way of saying that past experiences somehow color, shape the way in which we receive new experience. And if the past experience is one of trauma, then this is going to color and shape everything you experience in your life in the future. When trauma is part of your story, every new experience is colored by past pain, which can be confusing and overwhelming. And Persephone's phrase, screws you up, this screws you up, uses a language which is really very familiar, almost profane, to stress, the extent to which this is a gut experience. This is something that really punches you in the face somehow. But she carries on, everything's a lens through which another everything can be viewed. That screws you up and releases you. So there is release, there is possibility of moving on somehow. I look at dawn now, she says, and love the turning, the way that morning is both dead and new. Persephone adds that this experience can also set you free. She says she now looks at dawn and loves the way it changes from night to day. When you spend a night, especially without sleepless night, when you see, and night brings, all the negative thoughts in your mind, especially when you turn in your bed. But as soon as the light comes through, immediately your perception of everything changes, because light brings has an effect on our psychology. What matters, she says, is the turning itself. So again, we go back to the idea of liminality, in between, as being the place where the real things happen. And then the way that morning is both dead and new, this is the thing she likes and in which she finds release. Both dead and new, she's showing Jesus that you can hold pain and renewal at the same time. And she asks him, how about you? How about you? You see this to and fro carries on, and he replies, I like walking alone at twilight, he said. I like the in-between. Jesus points instead to twilight. She likes dawn, he likes twilight, another in-between moment. Like Persephone, he is learning how to live with uncertainty. He corresponds, in a sense, to her. Twilight is not a resolution, but a way of keeping going. And the conclusion of the psalm is also open-ended, as we've seen in previous psalms, intriguing. She held his gaze and asked, is that your answer? It's all I've got, he said. So Persephone pushes him to be clear. She senses Jesus' unease, his readiness to flee. The Jesus in this collection of poems is always looking for a way out of this underworld. Her gaze on him demands honesty. Her question, I think, can also be interpreted in another way. Is that your answer? Is really what you think? Or you're just trying to repeat what I'm saying? Just trying to please me by saying, oh, I like dawn and the turning, the way that morning is both dead and new. And he says, oh, well, I like twilight. I like the in-between. Have you really embraced, she seems to ask, the importance of coming to terms with liminality, with uncertainty? And his reply, it's all I've got, he said, refuses the kind of certainty usually expected from Jesus in Christian tradition. And instead of offering resolution, he gives something fragile and honest: survival, honesty about limits, and the willingness to stay with the uncertainty. Again, the only thing we can do is focus on one of these poems. I'm going to read it again now, and then we're going to have a kind of a small conversation about it. I don't know how you react to these poems, whether you find them just, original or quaint, but I think that when he says that he's trying to be playfully theological in these poems, he's doing something which is quite deep. He's playing with much more than much more than we would like to think. He plays with a lot of strands of spiritual and theological tradition he's aware of, so they are not as sacrilegious or as unorthodox as he would like us to think. And even if they seem to contradict a lot of the received images of Jesus we have, the reality is that probably they get something of who Jesus really is that speaks to his divinity, and particularly to the extent to which God really embraces human life, embraces not only human suffering, physical suffering, but also the psychological aspect of it, in ways that often are left unspoken in a lot of classical theological treatments of the Incarnation. So I'm going to read the poem again. Do you believe in God? After all that you've been through, she asked. I'm not sure, he said. Do you? Not like I used to, she replied. I grew up thinking God was light, then I went to where there was no light. I used to think that God made all things new, but I've been wandering a while now, nothing's new. Everything's a lens through which another everything can be viewed. That screws you up and releases you. I look at dawn now and love the turning, the way that morning is both dead and new. How about you? I like walking alone at twilight, he said. I like the in-between. She held his gaze, asked, Is that your answer? It's all I've got, he said.